I still remember the way the room smelled when they briefed us: stale coffee, old carpet, and the faint whiff of fear that no one wanted to acknowledge. They told us it was just another mission, another routine investigation, but I knew better. The moment I walked in and saw the look on the director's face, I felt the familiar knot tighten in my gut. This wasn't routine. This was something different, something wrong. The kind of wrong that burrows into your bones and stays with you long after the mission is over. The wild mountains of Montana weren't new to me. I'd seen terrain like that before, in places where nature doesn't give a damn about you, and every shadow could be hiding something that wants you dead. But this time, it was different. The locals were scared. Not the usual city folks in the wilderness scared, but something deeper, something primal. When we got to the town, you could feel it in the air, thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on you. And the looks they gave us as we passed by, like they knew we were already dead, we just hadn't figured it out yet. "What the hell are we dealing with here?" Jack muttered as we walked past the sheriff's office. He was a big guy, ex-Marine, the kind who doesn't scare easy. But even he looked rattled. I didn't answer him because I didn't have an answer. None of us did. All we had were whispers of lights in the sky, dead animals that shouldn't have been dead, and people who'd vanished without a trace. It didn't add up, and the more I thought about it, the more that knot in my gut twisted. Inside the sheriff's office, the place reeked of old sweat and desperation. The sheriff himself looked like he hadn't slept in days. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, eyes darting between us like a cornered animal. I just nodded. There wasn't much to say. We were here, and we were going to do our job, no matter how bad it got. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a mistake, that we were walking into something we weren't prepared for. Later that night, after we'd set up in the town's only motel, I found myself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The others were probably having the same problem, though nobody would admit it. Not yet. I kept replaying the day's events in my head, while trying to piece together the fragments of information we had, but it was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. There was something out there, something we weren't seeing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a noise outside. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was enough to send a jolt of adrenaline through me. I grabbed my gun and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. The street was empty, but the feeling was back, that sense of being watched. I scanned the area, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something to move, something to show itself. But there was nothing, just the silence, deep and oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. It was only when I finally backed away from the window that I realized my hands were shaking. This wasn't like me. I'd faced death more times than I could count, seen things that would make most people lose their minds. But this was different. There was something in those mountains, something we couldn't understand, and it was coming for us. I could feel it, deep in my bones. And the worst part, I wasn't sure we were going to make it out alive. The morning came too soon, and with it, a thick fog that clung to everything like a wet blanket. It made the already quiet town seem even more deserted, as if the fog had swallowed up whatever life was left. I stood outside, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. The others were up too, moving with a kind of sluggishness that told me I wasn't the only one who hadn't slept well. Emily was staring at her laptop, frowning at something on the screen. Jack was checking his gear, going through the motions like a machine. No one said much. There wasn't anything to say. We headed out to the site where the last group of cattle had vanished. The locals called it Devil's Hollow, and as soon as we stepped into that place, I understood why. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground was uneven, making every step feel like a potential misstep. And the silence, it was unnatural. Not a single bird, no rustle of leaves, nothing. Just the sound of our own breathing and the crunch of earth under our boots. Michael, you seeing this? Mark's voice cut through the silence, low and tense. He was pointing at his equipment, the readings spiking in ways they shouldn't. There's something off here, man. Electromagnetic fields are all over the place. I nodded, though I didn't need his confirmation. I could feel it too, that hum in the air that made your skin crawl. We pushed deeper into the hollow, every step heavier than the last, every shadow a potential threat. We found the first signs of the cattle a few minutes later, or rather, what was left of them. The carcasses were scattered across the clearing, torn apart like they'd been put through a blender. No tracks, no signs of struggle, just pieces. Rachel, our medic, turned away, gagging at the sight, and I couldn't blame her. I'd seen death before, plenty of it, but this was different. There was no logic, no reason to it, just pure, chaotic destruction. What could do this? Emily's voice was barely above a whisper, her usual calm shattered by the horror in front of us. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. We stood there, staring at the carnage, trying to make sense of the senseless. But there was no sense to be found. Just the growing realization that whatever we were dealing with wasn't something we could fight. At least, not in the way we were used to. As we turned to leave, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a flash of something, just beyond the trees. I whipped around, gun ready, but there was nothing. Just the fog, thick and impenetrable, and the faintest echo of something. Laughing? No, it had to be my imagination, the stress of the mission playing tricks on my mind. But the others felt it too. I could see it in their eyes, the same doubt, the same fear. We were in over our heads, and we knew it. Back at the motel, the silence was suffocating. No one wanted to be the first to admit it, but we were all thinking the same thing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human, and it wasn't going to let us leave. I sat on the edge of my bed, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I should have called it in, should have told the higher-ups that this was beyond our scope. But I didn't. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was something else. Either way, the decision had been made, and now we had to live with it, or die with it. The next day, the fog hadn't lifted. It hung there like a shroud, thickening the air and making everything feel even more suffocating. We decided to split up, cover more ground. It wasn't a good idea, but we were running out of options, and sitting around waiting for something to find us didn't seem much better. I took Jack with me, heading toward the outskirts of the town, where the forest crept in like a living thing. Emily stayed behind, trying to make sense of the data we'd collected, while Rachel and Mark checked out the local power station to see if the disturbances had any connection to the grid. Jack didn't say much as we walked, his eyes scanning the tree line, his hand never far from his weapon. I could tell he was on edge, and who could blame him? Hell, I wasn't exactly feeling steady myself. Every step felt heavier, like the earth was trying to pull us down, drag us into something dark and hungry. The trees were twisted, almost unnatural, as if they'd grown in ways they weren't supposed to, reaching out to snag us as we passed. "What do you think it is, Mike?" Jack finally broke the silence, his voice low, like he was afraid something would hear. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure what to say. How do you explain the unexplainable? How do you prepare someone for the fact that you might not be dealing with something of this world? "I don't know," I admitted, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "But whatever it is, it's playing with us, testing us." He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear. Jack was tough, one of the toughest I've known, but this was different. This wasn't something you could fight with fists or bullets. It was in the air, in our heads, twisting our thoughts, making us see things that weren't there, or maybe making us see things that were always there, hiding just beneath the surface. We reached a clearing, and that's when we saw it. A circle, burned into the ground, the grass blackened and dead. In the center, something metallic glinted in the weak light filtering through the fog. I approached cautiously, Jack covering me from a distance. The object was small, no bigger than a fist, and when I reached out to touch it, it felt cold, too cold, like it had been sitting there in the snow, though the air around us was warm and muggy. It was a piece of machinery, something that didn't belong out here. Wires, circuits, all arranged in a way that made no sense, like a puzzle that didn't fit together. "What the hell is that?" Jack's voice came from behind me, closer now, as he edged forward to get a better look. I shook my head, turning the device over in my hands, trying to piece together its purpose. But the longer I held it, the more I felt wrong. Like something was crawling up my spine, whispering into my ear in a language I couldn't understand. I dropped it, instinctively wiping my hands on my pants, trying to shake off the feeling. "We need to get back," I said, my voice harsher than I intended. Jack nodded, and we turned, making our way back the way we'd come. But the fog was thicker now, the path less clear, and the trees, they seemed closer somehow. Twisted branches reached out, snagging at our clothes, pulling us back. My heart pounded in my chest, every sense on high alert, every shadow a potential threat. By the time we got back to the motel, the others were already there, the same haunted look in their eyes. Emily was pale, her hands trembling as she tapped away at her keyboard, trying to make sense of the readings. Mark looked drained, like he'd aged 10 years in a day. Rachel sat in the corner, silent, her eyes distant, like she was somewhere else entirely. "We found something," I said, and their eyes snapped to me, desperate for answers, for anything that could make this all make sense. But I had nothing. Just more questions, more fear. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer, and we were running out of time. By nightfall, the fog had thickened into something almost tangible, a wall of white that seemed to press in on us from all sides. The motel felt like a cage, its walls too thin to keep out whatever was out there. We huddled around a single lamp, the only light we dared to keep on. The power was flickering, the lights dimming and surging as if the entire place was on life support. I could see it in their faces. Jack, Emily, Mark, Rachel. We were all running on fumes, the fear gnawing at us from the inside. "We can't stay here," Mark said, breaking the silence. His voice was strained, almost pleading. "This place, it's not safe. We need to leave, regroup somewhere else." "And go where?" I shot back, sharper than I meant to. "We're in the middle of nowhere, Mark. You think it's any better out there? Whatever this is, it's hunting us. It won't matter where we go." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. I didn't want to believe them, but deep down, I knew they were true. There was no running from this, no hiding. We were caught in something far bigger than us, and it was closing in. Emily was staring at her screen, eyes flicking back and forth like she was trying to decode something only she could see. "The patterns," she whispered, almost to herself. "It's like it's predicting our moves, staying one step ahead. It knows we're here, knows what we're doing." I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Emily wasn't the type to spook easily. If she was scared, it meant we were in deeper trouble than I'd thought. I moved closer, glancing at the data she was analyzing. It was a mess of numbers and signals, but even to my untrained eye, I could see the logic in it. Or maybe that was the problem. The logic was too perfect, too precise, like it was engineered by something not bound by the same rules we were. "What does it want?" Rachel's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes locked on the window, as if expecting something to burst through at any moment. No one answered. We didn't have an answer. Maybe it didn't want anything. Maybe it just wanted us gone. The thought gnawed at me, that we were nothing more than a nuisance, something to be swept aside. I found myself pacing, trying to burn off the energy, the fear. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that there were eyes out there in the dark, tracking our every move. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any second. "You think this is all connected?" Jack asked, his voice rough, breaking through my thoughts. "The disappearances, the dead animals, the whatever the hell that thing in the clearing was." "It has to be," I replied, more certain of that than anything else. "This isn't random. We're being toyed with, led along like rats in a maze. And the worst part? We didn't even know what we were up against. There was no face to this enemy, no clear target to take out, just the creeping dread that it was all closing in, the walls tightening around us, leaving no way out. I could feel it in my chest, that familiar pressure, the same one I'd felt in other missions gone wrong. But this time, there was no backup coming. Just us, a group of agents stranded in a nightmare with no clear way to wake up. We were out of options, out of time, and whatever was out there, knew it. The night stretched on, the hours dragging like they were pulling us into something darker. The fog outside seemed alive now, pressing against the windows, curling around the edges as if testing for weakness. Inside, the air was thick with tension, everyone too afraid to speak, too tired to plan. I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence, a constant reminder that we were still alive, though for how long I couldn't say. Emily was the first to notice it, her eyes suddenly widening as she stared at the screen. "Oh God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're not random. The signals, they're coordinates." She looked up at me, her face pale, like she'd just seen a ghost. It's been leading us somewhere, guiding us. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. We hadn't been investigating, we'd been following breadcrumbs laid out by whatever was playing this twisted game. Every step we took, every decision had been orchestrated. But to what end? I glanced at the others, the same dawning horror reflecting in their eyes. We weren't hunters, we were prey, being corralled into some final trap. What if? Jack's voice cracked, raw with fear. What if this is it, the end game? What if it wants us together here? His hand was shaking as he gripped his gun, but we both knew it wouldn't do us any good. Whatever was out there, it didn't need to fight us. It just needed us to stay put. Then the power cut out, plunging the room into darkness. The sudden silence was deafening, a void that swallowed all sound, all hope. The only light came from the flickering candles we'd set up earlier, their flames dancing erratically, as if they too were afraid. And then, the knocking started, slow, deliberate, from the front door. It wasn't frantic, wasn't desperate, it was calm, like someone who knew we had nowhere to go. I raised my gun, trying to steady my breathing. "Stay back," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to, my team or the thing on the other side of that door. The knocking continued, relentless, patient. Each knock seemed to reverberate through the floor, up my legs, settling deep in my chest. It was waiting for us to break, to make the first move. Mark suddenly lunged forward, yanking the door open with a defiant scream, and I braced for whatever horror awaited us. But there was nothing, just the fog, thick and impenetrable. But then I saw it, a shape just out of reach, standing in the fog, watching. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its eyes on us, feel its intent like a cold hand on the back of my neck. Rachel's scream snapped my attention back to the room. She was backing away from the far wall, her eyes wide with terror. I followed her gaze and saw what she had seen. Words scrawled across the wall in a dark, sticky substance that I knew wasn't paint. "You're already home." The letters dripped down like blood, each word a nail in our coffin. We weren't being led somewhere. We were already where it wanted us. This place, this town, had been the trap all along. It wasn't leading us here. It had been drawing us in, pulling us deeper into its web, tightening its grip with every step we took. We were never going to leave. And deep down, I think we all knew it. I felt a cold chill wash over me, settling into my bones. We had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered by something that didn't belong in our world. And now, as I looked at my team, I knew this was the end. The thing outside wasn't trying to get in. It was just watching, waiting for us to understand. We were home. We had been all along. We finally arrived at Lakeview Manor just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was a bruised purple, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. I remember feeling a mix of excitement and unease as David and I stood at the foot of the old house, staring up at its crumbling facade. The place had seen better days, no doubt, but we were determined to bring it back to life. I could see the potential beneath the decay, the elegant lines of the architecture, the tall windows that once must have let in streams of sunlight. But now, those windows seemed like dark eyes watching us, and the house loomed over us with a quiet, almost menacing presence. "This is it," David said, trying to sound more confident than he probably felt. I nodded, forcing a smile, though a cold knot of apprehension had already settled in my stomach. I chalked it up to nerves, the weight of taking on such a massive project. After all, who wouldn't feel a little anxious standing in front of a place like this? Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust, and the scent of something I couldn't quite place, something old and forgotten. The floors creaked under our feet as we walked through the grand foyer, our footsteps echoing in the emptiness. There were cobwebs in every corner, and the walls were lined with peeling wallpaper that might have been beautiful once, but now it hung in tattered strips. I shivered and wrapped my arms around myself, trying to shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. As we explored further, I couldn't help but notice the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind you find in most old houses. This was different, oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. In the dining room, a massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals coated in dust, and the long table beneath it was covered in a thick layer of grime. David was already talking about refinishing the floors, restoring the woodwork, but I couldn't focus on his words. My attention was drawn to the large mirror hanging on the wall, its surface cloudy with age. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the reflection, a flicker of motion that didn't match my own. I blinked, and it was gone, but the unease lingered. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. David looked up from his inspection of the fireplace, frowning. "See what?" I hesitated, feeling silly. "Nothing. Probably just a trick of the light." He shrugged and went back to his work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was as if the house had eyes, peering at us from every shadowed corner. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I found myself wishing for some kind of noise, anything to break the suffocating silence. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the stress of the move, but deep down, I knew there was something more to it. Something I couldn't explain. I took a deep breath and forced myself to focus, trying to push the growing sense of dread to the back of my mind. This was our home now. We had to make it work. Days passed, but the unease never left. The manor was silent, too silent. I would be working in one of the rooms, scraping away old wallpaper or cleaning grime off the floors, and suddenly I'd feel it, this heavy, suffocating presence, like something was right behind me, watching. Every time I'd turn around, though, there was nothing, just the empty room and the sound of my own breathing, quick and shallow. David didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't want to. He buried himself in the renovations, talking about paint colors and furniture layouts as if that would drown out the creeping dread that had started to take root in my mind. I tried to do the same, but it wasn't so easy. There were moments when I'd catch glimpses of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting along the wall, a flicker of movement in a darkened hallway, but it was always gone before I could really see it. One night, while David was out getting supplies, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It started as a faint whisper, barely audible, but as I stood there, frozen in the hallway, it grew louder. Voices. Plural. Murmuring just beyond the range of comprehension. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but there was something unmistakably malevolent in those hushed tones. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind or maybe the old pipes creaking. But deep down, I knew better. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving an even more unsettling silence in its wake. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the dimly lit hallway. I didn't know what I was expecting to see, but the absence of anything visible only made the fear worse. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run, to get out of that house, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. When David came home later, I tried to tell him about the voices, about the shadows that seemed to move on their own, but he just laughed it off. "You've been watching too many horror movies, Sarah," he said, ruffling my hair in that playful way he always did. But there was an edge to his voice, a forced lightness that made me wonder if he was starting to feel it too. I didn't push it. Maybe it was better if we both pretended nothing was wrong. But the tension between us was growing, feeding off the unease that clung to every corner of the manor. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house. Every little noise set my nerves on edge. I kept thinking about the whispers, about the way they had stopped as soon as I acknowledged them, like whoever, or whatever, had been speaking knew I was listening. I turned over, trying to block out the thoughts, but it was no use. Sleep was impossible in a place like this. The next morning, I woke up to find David already gone. He'd left a note on the kitchen counter, something about meeting with a contractor in town. The house felt even emptier without him there, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It had become a constant presence, this nagging sense that I wasn't alone, that unseen eyes were tracking my every move. I tried to ignore it as I went about my day, but it was like trying to ignore the feeling of a spider crawling up your spine. I decided to spend the morning in the library, hoping to distract myself with work. The room was lined with dusty old books, their spines cracked and faded. Most of them were in languages I didn't understand, but one book caught my eye, a thick, leather-bound journal hidden behind a stack of crumbling papers. The cover was worn, the leather soft and smooth from years of handling. I opened it, expecting to find the usual scribbles of some long-dead owner. What I found instead made my breath catch in my throat. The journal belonged to a woman named Evelyn, one of the manor's previous residents. Her writing started off normal enough, notes about the house, the weather, her daily life. But as I read on, her entries grew darker, more frantic. She wrote about strange noises in the night, about seeing things that weren't there, just like I had. Her last few entries were nearly illegible, the handwriting jagged and erratic. The final entry was a single, chilling sentence, "The house knows." I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in on me. I had to get out. I needed air. I bolted out of the library, the echoes of my footsteps chasing me down the hallway. When I reached the front door, I yanked it open, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. The cool air outside hit me like a slap, but even in the open, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. David found me on the porch when he came back, sitting on the steps with the journal clutched in my hands. I must have looked as shaken as I felt, because his expression immediately changed from casual concern to alarm. "Sarah, what happened?" he asked, his voice softer now, the playful edge gone. I handed him the journal, not trusting myself to speak. He flipped through it, his frown deepening with each page. When he finally looked up at me, his face was pale. This is just some old diary," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I could tell he was trying to believe it, trying to convince both of us that it didn't matter, that it was just the ramblings of a disturbed mind. But the fear in his eyes told me he wasn't so sure anymore. "I think we need to leave," I whispered, the words almost getting stuck in my throat. The idea of staying in that house, knowing what I knew now, was unbearable. But David hesitated, glancing back at the manor, as if he couldn't quite bring himself to give up on the place. "Sarah, it's just an old house," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the desire to stay, to finish what we'd started, warring with the growing fear that maybe, just maybe, there was something truly wrong here. I didn't push him. I didn't have the energy to argue, not when I was barely holding myself together. But I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The house wasn't done with us yet, and I wasn't sure how much longer we could pretend everything was fine. That night, the house seemed more alive than ever, as if it had been holding back and was now ready to reveal its true nature. I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, feeling the weight of the silence around me. David was asleep beside me, his breathing steady, but I couldn't relax. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows felt deliberate, like the house was trying to get under my skin. I told myself to calm down, to breathe, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, not like someone wandering aimlessly in the dark. My first thought was that David had gotten up, maybe to check on something. But when I reached over, his side of the bed was empty, the sheets still warm. I called his name, my voice barely above a whisper, but there was no answer. The footsteps continued, growing fainter, as if whoever or whatever was walking away from our room. I slipped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was dark, too dark, like the shadows had thickened and stretched, swallowing the light. I hesitated at the doorway, my hand resting on the frame, trying to muster the courage to step out. Part of me wanted to turn back, to hide under the covers and pretend this wasn't happening, but something else, something deeper, pushed me forward. I had to know. I followed the sound of the footsteps, my bare feet barely making a sound on the cold floor. The air grew colder as I walked, the temperature dropping with each step. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been, stretching out endlessly before me. At the far end, I saw a figure, just a shadow at first, but as I drew closer, it took shape. David. He was standing in front of the mirror in the old guest room, his back to me, staring at his reflection. David? My voice trembled as I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, unnervingly still, like he was in a trance. I approached slowly, my hand outstretched to touch his shoulder. When I finally did, his skin was cold, much colder than it should have been. He flinched at my touch, as if he hadn't heard me coming, and turned to face me. His eyes were wide, his pupils dilated, and there was a look of pure terror on his face. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I saw something. In the mirror." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could feel my own fear rising. "It wasn't me," he said, his voice shaking. "My reflection, it was moving on its own, doing things I wasn't doing." I glanced at the mirror, half expecting to see something staring back at us, but it was just our reflections, standing side by side. But the way David looked at it, like it was something monstrous, sent chills down my spine. I didn't know what to say, how to comfort him when I was just as terrified. "We need to leave," I said finally, my voice firm despite the tremor in my hands. "We can't stay here anymore." David nodded, but he didn't move, his eyes still locked on the mirror. I had to practically drag him out of the room, away from whatever had held him captive. As we left, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the mirror, a flicker of movement that wasn't ours. I forced myself to look away, to keep walking, but the image stayed with me long after we'd returned to our room. We didn't sleep that night. David sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the floor, his hands trembling. I paced the room, trying to figure out what to do next. The idea of staying another minute in that house was unbearable, but the thought of leaving in the middle of the night with whatever was lurking in the shadows felt just as terrifying. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting something to burst through it, but the house remained eerily quiet, as if it was waiting, watching. "We should pack a few things," I said, breaking the silence. "We can leave now, find a motel, and come back for the rest in the morning." My voice sounded thin, desperate, even to my own ears, but David nodded, finally breaking out of his daze. He moved mechanically, like he was on autopilot, grabbing clothes and shoving them into a bag. I did the same, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold on to anything. Every noise, the rustle of fabric, the zip of the bags, seemed amplified in the oppressive silence, each sound like a warning. We were almost ready to go when we heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from the hallway. My heart leaped into my throat as I realized it was getting closer, the sound echoing off the walls. David froze, his face draining of what little color remained. I grabbed his arm, pulling him towards the door, but he resisted, his eyes fixed on the hallway outside our room. "We have to go," I hissed, but he just shook his head, backing away from the door. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the thumping stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, like the house was holding its breath. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my whole body tense, waiting for something to happen. Then, the doorknob turned, ever so slowly, and the door creaked open. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead, my feet rooted to the floor. But there was no one there. The hallway was empty. I almost laughed out of sheer relief, but the sound died in my throat when I noticed something on the floor just outside the door, a trail of muddy footprints leading down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. The prints were fresh, the mud still wet, but they were too small to be David's. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who else could have been in the house? David stepped into the hallway, the port following the trail with a distant look on his face. "We need to see where they lead," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "David, we need to get out of here. Now." But he wasn't listening. He was already moving down the hallway, his gaze fixed on the footprints. I didn't want to be alone, so I followed, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run. The prints led us down the hall to the library. The door was ajar, the room beyond it dark and silent. David pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The room was as we'd left it, except for one thing. The journal was lying open on the floor, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. I knew we hadn't left it that way. David knelt down, picking up the book, and as he did, his expression changed. He turned it towards me, his face ashen. The journal was open to a page I hadn't seen before, the handwriting different, more jagged, almost like it had been scratched into the paper. The words sent a chill through me. It's already inside. At that moment, the air in the room grew thick, stifling. I could feel something shifting, the atmosphere charged with a malevolent energy. David's eyes met mine, and I saw the realization dawning in them. Whatever had been haunting us, whatever had been playing with our minds, it was no longer just a presence in the house. It was with us, in us, feeding off our fear, growing stronger. I felt a cold, creeping sensation at the back of my neck, like icy fingers brushing against my skin. I turned to look, but there was nothing there, just the empty room, and yet I could feel it, the thing from the mirror, the whispers in the walls. It was inside me now, crawling beneath my skin. David dropped the journal, backing away as if he couldn't bear to look at me. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stare at him as the realization sank in that we were already too late. We hadn't just been living in the house had been living in us. When we first pulled up to the house in Willow Creek, I felt an uneasy mix of hope and dread. The house stood there, old and weathered, with peeling paint and sagging roof lines. It wasn't exactly the fresh start we had imagined, but it was something. Our last shot at fixing what had been broken for so long. Lisa stepped out of the car first, her eyes scanning the property with that familiar, distant look she'd had for months. "It's quiet," she said softly, almost to herself. I wanted to say something reassuring, to make her believe this could be the place where we'd find each other again. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, gripping the steering wheel a little too hard before finally forcing myself to join her. The air inside the house was stale, carrying the scent of dust and neglect. Every step we took sent echoes through the empty rooms, amplifying the silence between us. Lisa wandered off to explore while I lingered in the foyer, staring at the grand staircase that spiraled up into darkness. There was something unsettling about the way the shadows clung to the corners, as if the house itself was hiding secrets, watching us. "I'll start unpacking." Lisa's voice broke the quiet, but it sounded far away, like she was already slipping further out of reach. I followed her into the living room, where the furniture covered in white sheets looked like ghosts frozen in time. "Yeah," I muttered, more to myself than to her. "Let's get settled." As we worked in silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The creaking floorboards, the way the wind seemed to whisper through the cracks in the windows, it all felt too alive, too aware. But I didn't want to be the one to voice it, to give life to the fear that was gnawing at the edges of my mind. I needed this place to work. We needed it. Later that evening, I found Lisa in the attic, crouched over a dusty wooden box. "Look at this," she said, holding up a weathered diary. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed with age. "There's a whole stack of them." I watched her flip through the pages, her expression unreadable. "Someone lived here a long time ago," she murmured, almost as if speaking to the house itself. I forced a laugh, trying to break the tension. "Maybe we'll find some juicy old secrets," I joked, but Lisa didn't respond. She just kept reading, her eyes narrowing with each page. Something twisted in my gut, a sharp pang of unease. I pushed it down, tried to focus on anything but the creeping sense that we just stepped into something we weren't meant to find. But it was too late. The house had already wrapped itself around us, and as night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it started tightening its grip. That night, I barely slept. The bed felt too big, too cold, like there was a space between us that no amount of covers could close. I could hear Lisa breathing beside me, but it was strained, uneven. She kept shifting, as if trying to escape a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. I wanted to reach out, pull her close, but something held me back. Maybe it was the thought that she'd pull away, or maybe it was the house, its oppressive silence pressing down on us both. In the early hours of the morning, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it, a faint, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but then it came again, closer this time. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the sound stopped, leaving behind an eerie stillness that was somehow worse. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling, that old houses made noises, that there was nothing to worry about, but my mind wouldn't let it go. It replayed the sound over and over, each time growing louder in my memory, until it felt like it was right outside our door. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, I found Lisa back in the attic, surrounded by the diaries. She barely noticed when I walked in, her focus entirely on the pages in front of her. "You've been up here all morning?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed the unease I couldn't shake. She nodded without looking up, her face pale and drawn. "These diaries, they're disturbing, Mark. The things these people wrote, it's like they were losing their minds." I forced a smile, hoping to lighten the mood. "It's just old stories, Lisa. Probably exaggerated. You know how people can be." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The words felt hollow, like they were meant to reassure me more than her. She finally looked at me, and in her eyes I saw the same fear that had been gnawing at me all night. "We should leave, Mark," she said quietly. "This place isn't right." I wanted to agree, to pack up and drive away, but something in me resisted. Maybe it was stubbornness, or the hope that leaving would mean we were giving up, not just on the house, but on us. "We just got here," I replied, trying to sound convincing. "Let's give it a little more time. It's probably just nerves, getting used to a new place." But as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't enough. The house had already started working its way into our minds, and I could feel it tightening its hold with each passing minute. By the time night fell again, the unease had grown into a full-blown dread. Every creak, every rustle in the dark felt like a warning, and when I heard the dragging sound again, I knew it wasn't just the house settling. Something was moving, something unseen, and it was getting closer. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening as the sound crept down the hallway toward our bedroom. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. But I knew, deep down, that it was far from over. The third night was the worst. By then the house had settled into our bones, its presence a constant weight on my chest. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far, linger a little too long. Lisa and I barely spoke, each of us lost in our own spiraling thoughts. The distance between us felt like a chasm, and I didn't know how to bridge it. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my blood run cold, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like knuckles rapping against wood. I froze, listening as the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from inside the walls, right behind our bed. I could feel it, the vibrations creeping through the headboard, right into my spine. Lisa stirred beside me, and I knew she heard it too. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer because I didn't know. All I could do was stare at the wall, willing the noise to stop, but it only grew more intense, more demanding, until it was pounding in my ears. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I threw off the covers and jumped out of bed, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. "Stay here," I told Lisa, though I could see in her eyes she didn't want me to leave her alone. But I had to find out what was causing that noise, even if the thought of facing it terrified me. I crept down the hallway, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The tapping echoed through the walls, leading me toward the source, and as I approached the attic door, it stopped. I stood there, my hand hovering over the doorknob, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whatever was behind that door could hear it. Taking a deep breath, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The attic was pitch black, the smell of dust and old wood thick in the air. I swept the flashlight around, but nothing seemed out of place. The boxes, the old furniture, the stack of diaries Lisa had been reading, it all looked just as we'd left it. But then the tapping started again, directly above me. My heart skipped a beat as I shined the light upward, catching a glimpse of something I couldn't quite make out. A shape, something pale, shifting in the darkness. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking, but only the silence answered me. I didn't wait to see what might happen next. I slammed the door shut and bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my rush. By the time I reached the bedroom, I was out of breath, my skin clammy with sweat. Lisa was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted, feeling the words stick in my throat. "But whatever it is, it's not something we can just ignore." I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that was gnawing at me, growing stronger with each passing hour. We both knew that whatever haunted this house wasn't going to let us go easily, and the realization of that fact hit me like a punch to the gut. We were trapped, not just in this house, but in something far darker, far more insidious than we could have ever imagined. The following day, Lisa looked even more pale and distant. I could see the fear etched into her face, the way her hands trembled when she reached for her coffee. Neither of us had the courage to talk about what happened in the attic, but the tension between us grew like a cancer, spreading into every corner of our minds. We moved through the house like ghosts ourselves, avoiding eye contact, avoiding the subject. But the weight of what was happening pressed down on us, heavy and inescapable. By late afternoon, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I found her sitting by the window in the living room, staring out at the overgrown yard, lost in thought. "Lisa," I began, hesitating when she didn't respond. "We need to talk about this. Whatever's in this house, it's not something we can ignore. We need to decide what to do." She turned to me, her eyes glassy, as if she'd been somewhere far away. "What can we do, Mark?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not like we can just pack up and leave. We don't even know what we're dealing with." The frustration bubbled up inside me, mixing with the fear. "We can't stay here. You've seen what this place is doing to us. It's driving us apart, making us doubt everything. We need to get out before it's too late." But Lisa just shook her head, a strange calm settling over her. "And go where? Whatever this is, it's not just in the house, Mark. It's in us. It's in our minds. You felt it, didn't you? It won't let us go. Leaving won't change anything." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was right, even if I didn't want to admit it. The house had already wormed its way inside our heads, twisting our thoughts, making us see and hear things that shouldn't be there. It was like the place was feeding on our fear, growing stronger with every passing moment. That night, the sounds started earlier. The tapping, the whispers, the faint creak of footsteps in the hallway. Lisa and I sat in the dark, too afraid to move, too afraid to sleep. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like it was pressing down on us from all sides. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out the world outside. Every shadow seemed to shift, every flicker of light took on a sinister shape. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of Lisa's voice, panicked and shaky. "Mark, wake up! It's in the room!" I shot up in bed, my heart racing as I fumbled for the flashlight. The darkness was thick, almost tangible, and the air was freezing, colder than it had any right to be. I swung the light around, but there was nothing there, just the oppressive blackness pressing in on us. But then I saw it, a figure, barely visible in the corner of the room, where the light from the hallway barely reached. It was pale, almost translucent, like it was made of smoke. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel it watching us, feel its presence like a weight on my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to even breathe. Lisa grabbed my arm, her grip like a vice. "We have to leave, Mark. Now, before it's too late." I could hear the desperation in her voice, feel it mirrored in my own chest. But as much as I wanted to, as much as I knew she was right, something kept me rooted to the spot, like the house itself was holding me back. We were trapped, caught in a nightmare that had no end, and the only thing I knew for sure was that whatever happened next, we wouldn't be the same after it was over. We didn't wait for morning. The moment the figure vanished, we started packing. There wasn't much to gather, just the essentials. Lisa was frantic, throwing things into bags without care, her movements jerky, desperate. I wasn't much better. My hands shook as I tried to shove clothes into a suitcase, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. Every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed to shift, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. "I can't stay here another minute," Lisa muttered, more to herself than to me. I could hear the fear in her voice, the raw edge of panic that matched my own. We were both unraveling, the last threads of our sanity fraying in the oppressive darkness. I didn't argue. There was no point. I just nodded, swallowing down the rising dread that threatened to choke me. We grabbed our things and made for the door, moving quickly, like if we just moved fast enough, we could outrun whatever was lurking in the house. But as we reached the front door, something made me pause. I don't know what it was. A compulsion, a pull I couldn't resist. I glanced back, just for a second, and that's when I saw it. The diaries. They were scattered on the floor where Lisa had left them, the pages fluttering as if stirred by a breeze. But there was no breeze. The air was still, thick with tension. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The pages, they were covered in writing, but it wasn't the faded ink of the original author. It was fresh, the words scrawled in a shaky hand that I recognized all too well, my own. I froze, staring at the pages as the reality of what I was seeing sank in. Somehow, I had written in those diaries, or at least something had used my hand to do it. The words were a jumbled mess, half-formed sentences and fragments of thoughts, but one phrase stood out, repeated over and over again. "It won't let you leave." "Mark, what are you doing? We have to go." Lisa's voice snapped me out of my daze. I tore my eyes away from the pages and rushed to the door, but the moment my hand touched the doorknob, a cold dread washed over me. I turned the knob, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked, not by any physical mechanism, but by something far more sinister. The house wasn't going to let us go. Lisa's eyes widened in terror as she realized the same thing. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, searching for any way out, but there was nothing. We were trapped, not just in the house, but in a web of something far darker, something that had been waiting for us from the moment we arrived. And then, as if in response to our fear, the house began to change. The walls seemed to pulse, the very air growing thicker, suffocating. The shadows deepened, twisting into grotesque shapes that danced in the corners of my vision. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, surrounding us, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. But the worst part, the part that still haunts me, was the realization that the house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. It had been feeding on us, on our fear, on our pain, growing stronger with each passing moment. And as the walls began to close in, the whispers growing to a deafening roar, I understood the truth. We weren't just its victims, we were its prisoners. The house had claimed us, and there was no escape. As the darkness swallowed us whole, I reached for Lisa's hand, holding on as tightly as I could, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't enough. We had walked into the house of our own free will, but we would never leave. The house had won, and as the last sliver of light faded away, I knew that the real horror wasn't what we had seen, but what was yet to come. I was always the skeptic, the one who needed hard evidence before I believed anything. Ghosts, hauntings, all that supernatural nonsense. It was just that to me, nonsense. So when I was asked to investigate Oak Ridge, I didn't hesitate. Another ghost town with a tragic backstory, another chance to debunk the myths that kept people like me in business. The town had been abandoned for decades after some catastrophic event. It sounded like the perfect case to unravel. The drive up to Oak Ridge was long and lonely, with the roads narrowing as I approached the town. The trees grew thicker, their branches stretching over the road like skeletal arms, blocking out the sun. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, but the quiet was unsettling. As I crossed the threshold into Oak Ridge, the air seemed to change. It felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me, squeezing my chest. I shook off the feeling and focused on the task at hand. I was here to prove that this place was nothing more than a crumbling relic of the past. The town itself was a ghost of what it once was. Buildings stood, but only just, their wooden frames creaking with the weight of time. Windows, long shattered, gaped like empty eyes. I pulled out my camera and started recording, narrating my observations. Oak Ridge, once a thriving community, now just another casualty of time. My voice sounded hollow in the empty streets, the only noise for miles. I wasn't scared, not really, but there was something about this place that made my skin prickle. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to cling to the buildings, refusing to let go. I wandered through the main street, passing what used to be the general store, the school, and the town hall. All of them were in various states of decay, but the town hall caught my eye. The doors were slightly ajar, swaying in the breeze that had picked up. I felt a strange pull toward it, like I was being drawn in by some invisible force. I shook my head, trying to clear it. "Get a grip, Emma," I muttered to myself. "You're here to debunk, not to get spooked by some old doors." Inside the town hall, the air was even colder. My breath came out in visible puffs, which was odd considering it was still summer. The floorboards groaned under my weight, echoing in the vast emptiness of the room. As I stepped further in, something caught my attention. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I spun around, camera at the ready, but there was nothing, just shadows dancing on the walls. My heart was pounding now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. "It's just your mind playing tricks," I whispered, though the words felt weak even to me. I kept exploring, moving into the back rooms. Dust covered everything, tables, chairs, papers scattered on the floor. I reached down to pick one up, but before my fingers touched it, I froze. There it was again, that flicker of movement. But this time, it wasn't in the corner of my eye. It was right in front of me, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, moving against the light. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow shifted, almost as if it was aware of me. For the first time since I arrived, a chill ran down my spine. I had the overwhelming sense that something was watching me, something that shouldn't be there, something that was waiting. I stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where the shadow had been. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. "It's just a trick of the light," I whispered, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. But the logical part of my brain wasn't winning the battle. I could still feel it, something lingering in the air, something I couldn't see but knew was there. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to move. My legs felt like lead, but I pushed forward, stepping deeper into the room. The dust in the air made it hard to breathe, and I could taste the decay on my tongue. The walls were lined with old photographs, their frames crooked and glass shattered. I scanned each one, looking for something, anything that could explain what I'd just experienced. The people in the photos stared back at me, their expressions hauntingly blank, as if they knew something I didn't. I shook my head, trying to shake off the creeping dread that was wrapping itself around me. I turned back toward the entrance, needing to get out, to clear my head. But as I reached the door, it slammed shut on its own. I jumped, my pulse skyrocketing as I rushed to grab the handle. It wouldn't budge. "This can't be happening," I muttered, yanking harder. The door remained stubbornly closed, and panic began to rise in my throat. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. I banged on the door with my fist, the sound echoing in the empty hall. "Let me out!" I shouted, but my voice came back to me, hollow and mocking. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I backed away from the door. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to get out of this place, but I was trapped. My eyes darted around the room, looking for another exit, but there was none. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows growing darker, more menacing. I could hear my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, the only sound in the oppressive silence. "This isn't real," I kept repeating in my head, but it felt very real, too real. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again, a shadow, slithering along the wall, moving with a purpose. This time, I didn't look away. My whole body tensed as I watched it glide across the room, its form shifting and changing, like it was searching for something, or someone. My throat tightened, and I felt my knees weaken. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as the shadow crept closer, its presence filling the room with a suffocating darkness. Just as it reached me, everything went black. I don't know how long I stood there, engulfed in the void, But when the light returned, the shadow was gone. The door was open again, swinging gently as if it had never been locked. I stumbled forward, my legs shaky, my mind reeling. I didn't understand what was happening, but one thing was clear. I needed to get out of Oak Ridge. Whatever was here, it wasn't something I could explain away with science or logic. It was something much worse, something that defied everything I believed in. I stumbled out of the town hall, my mind racing with thoughts that refused to settle. I was desperate to leave Oak Ridge, but something about this place had its hooks in me. The air was thick with a strange energy, almost like the town itself was alive, watching, waiting. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadow following me, but there was nothing, just the eerie stillness of a town that shouldn't exist. I needed answers. My hands shook as I pulled out my notebook, flipping through the pages where I'd scribbled down everything I could find about Oak Ridge. The town's history was murky at best, rumors of a cult, whispers of dark rituals, but nothing concrete. It all sounded like the kind of urban legends that thrive in places like this, stories meant to keep people away. But now, standing here, with the memories of that shadow fresh in my mind, those stories felt less like fiction and more like a warning. I decided to head to the library, or what was left of it. If there was any truth to the rumors, I'd find it there. The building was one of the few still standing, its roof partially collapsed, with broken windows and shelves covered in dust. Books lay scattered on the floor, their pages yellowed and brittle. The air smelled of mildew and decay, but beneath that, there was something else. A faint scent of something burned, something old and wrong. As I sifted through the wreckage, I found an old ledger, its cover cracked and faded. It listed names, people who had lived in Oak Ridge before the disaster. Most of the entries were ordinary, but a few were marked with strange symbols, ones I didn't recognize. My pulse quickened as I realized these names were connected to the cult. The dates next to them matched the time when the town started to fall apart, when people began to disappear. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I pieced it together. The rituals, the shadows, the catastrophic event, it was all linked. I ran my fingers over one of the symbols, tracing its lines, trying to make sense of it. The moment my skin touched the paper, a jolt shot through me, like I'd been electrocuted. I yanked my hand back, heart pounding. "What the hell?" I muttered, staring at the symbol as if it would explain itself. But there was nothing, just the faint crackling of something unseen, something I could almost feel pressing against my mind. I knew I was onto something, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever force was at work here was aware of me, tracking my every move. A sound broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I listened. It was coming from the far end of the library, where the shadows were darkest. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move toward the noise, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and with each step, the air grew colder, heavier. My breath came out in shaky gasps, my heart hammering in my chest. When I finally reached the source of the sound, I found an old desk, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. The tapping stopped the moment I touched it, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as I slowly opened the desk drawer. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age, and covered in the same strange symbols I'd seen before. But this time, there was something else, a message scrawled in shaky handwriting. It read, "You're not supposed to be here. Leave before it's too late." My blood ran cold as I stared at the words. They felt like a direct command, an order from something far beyond my understanding. For the first time since I arrived, I felt real fear, deep and paralyzing. I didn't know who had left the message or when, but I knew one thing. I needed to get out of Oak Ridge before whatever was here decided it was done playing with me. I left the library, clutching the paper with the chilling warning. The sense of urgency was overwhelming. My mind raced with the implications of what I had just read. Whatever force was haunting Oak Ridge had become aware of me, and it was trying to drive me away. I needed to figure out what was really happening, but I knew I couldn't stay in the town any longer than necessary. The only lead I had was the old tunnel system beneath Oak Ridge, rumored to be linked to the cult's activities. I'd heard whispers about it from locals who had lived nearby before the town was abandoned. They said the tunnels were a labyrinth of darkness and danger, but right now, it seemed like my only option. I steeled myself and made my way to the entrance I had found earlier. As I approached the tunnel entrance, the atmosphere grew colder, the air thick with an unsettling silence. The entrance was obscured by a tangle of vines and debris, but I managed to clear enough to squeeze through. The darkness inside was absolute, swallowing the light from my flashlight. I shone the beam ahead, illuminating damp, uneven walls and a floor covered in a thick layer of muck. The deeper I ventured, the more oppressive the tunnel became. The air was damp and musty, carrying the smell of rot and decay. Every step echoed in the confined space, a constant reminder of how alone I was. My flashlight flickered occasionally, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I told myself it was just the light, but the shadows seemed to move of their own accord, as if they were alive. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic drumming sound, much like the tapping I'd heard in the library, but closer now. It was coming from further down the tunnel, resonating off the walls with an eerie consistency. My pulse quickened as I followed the sound, each step making the darkness feel even more suffocating. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and my breaths became shallow and rapid. I reached a large chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. The drumming was louder now, more insistent. I swept my flashlight around, revealing strange symbols carved into the walls. They matched the ones from the desk drawer. In the center of the room, an altar made of rough stone stood ominously, covered in dust and grime. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, but the energy in the room felt charged, almost electric. As I approached the altar, the drumming stopped abruptly. An oppressive silence filled the space, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I could feel the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on me, as if the very walls were closing in. The flashlight flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging me into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to turn back on. Panic set in as the darkness closed in around me, thick and suffocating. Then I felt it, a cold, unseen presence brushing against my skin, a whisper of something ancient and malevolent. The air grew colder, and the room seemed to contract around me. I managed to get the flashlight working again, its beam weak but enough to reveal a figure standing by the altar. It was a shadowy shape, not quite human, its form shifting and writhing in the dim light. I could feel its gaze, heavy and penetrating, as if it were staring straight into my soul. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, my mind racing with terror and disbelief. I had no choice but to confront whatever this was, or risk becoming another forgotten soul, lost in the darkness of Oak Ridge. I stared at the shadowy figure by the altar, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The figure shifted and writhed, its form defying description, as if it were made of the very darkness that surrounded me. My flashlight's weak beam cast eerie, flickering light over it, revealing glimpses of something that should not exist. My fear was overwhelming, paralyzing, but I forced myself to move. I reached for my camera, my hands trembling, and began recording the figure. This has to be documented, I thought. Though my voice sounded strained and thin in the oppressive silence, the figure seemed to notice the light, its movements becoming more erratic. It was as if it were reacting to my presence, aware of me in a way that defied logic. The chilling cold in the room intensified, and I could see my breath crystallizing in the air. The figure began to form more clearly, its shape resembling something almost human, but distorted, twisted. It let out a low, guttural sound, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized the sound was trying to communicate, but the words were a garbled mess of static and whispers. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my composure, but the figure's presence was suffocating. My flashlight flickered again, and as the light waned, I saw something else, a reflection in the altar's surface. It was me, but distorted and ghostly, my own face twisted in fear. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The figure wasn't just a haunting presence, it was tied to me, to my own fears and vulnerabilities. As I struggled to grasp this new understanding, the room seemed to shift around me. The walls began to close in, and the darkness grew thicker, pressing against me from all sides. Panic surged through me. I have to get out, I thought, but the entrance to the tunnel seemed to have disappeared. The shadows were closing in, and the weight of the air made it hard to breathe. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the flashlight flickered back to life. The figure was gone, but the chamber was now covered in strange, glowing symbols I hadn't seen before. My heart pounded as I saw the symbols form a pattern on the walls, a message that seemed to be written in a language I couldn't comprehend. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers were gone, but the sense of dread remained. I managed to find my way back to the entrance of the tunnel, my mind reeling from the encounter. I fled from Oak Ridge as fast as I could, my heart racing, my thoughts a chaotic jumble. I knew I'd have to leave the town behind, but as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The shadowy figure, the whispers, they were now a part of me, haunting my every step. As the town disappeared in the rearview mirror, I realized that the darkness of Oak Ridge wasn't confined to its ruins. It had found its way into me, and it was never going to let go. Shadow Hill was supposed to be my escape, a place where I could finally find some peace after everything that had happened. The town was small, tucked away from the rush of the world, just the kind of place where I could lose myself in the quiet. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could start over here. But from the moment I arrived, something felt off. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and there was a stillness that hung over everything, like the town was holding its breath, waiting. My first night was restless. I couldn't sleep, not really. Every creak of the old house, every groan of the wind against the windows kept me on edge. Around midnight, I thought I heard something, muffled voices, distant and low, almost like a chant. I sat up, straining to listen, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat, loud in my ears. I got up and went to the window, my breath fogging up the glass as I stared out at the dark. That's when I saw them, flickering lights near the cemetery, moving slowly like they were searching for something, or someone. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe just a trick of the light, or some kids messing around. But deep down, I knew better. I've been around long enough to know when something's wrong, and everything about this place felt wrong. Still, I wasn't going to jump to conclusions. Not yet. I needed to see for myself what kind of place I had moved into, and who or what was waiting for me. The next day, I walked into town, trying to shake off the unease. Shadow Hill was quaint, all right, neatly kept houses, friendly enough folks who nodded as I passed. But there was something underneath, a tension I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't just the usual small-town gossip or the way everyone seemed to know each other's business. It was like they were all in on some secret, something they weren't about to share with an outsider like me. I ended up at the diner, needing some coffee to clear my head. That's where I first heard about David Harper. I overheard a couple of old-timers talking at the counter, their voices low, as if they didn't want to be overheard. They were saying he'd killed himself, just last week. Hung himself out in his shed, no note, nothing. They said he'd been acting strange in the days leading up to it, talking about seeing things that shouldn't have been there. A shadow, one of them said, always right behind him, no matter where he went. I felt that old instinct kicking in, the one that had kept me alive through years of working the force. Something didn't add up. People don't just snap like that, not without a reason. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that there's always a reason. I decided then and there I was going to find out what had really happened to David Harper. I didn't know it at the time, but that decision would pull me into a darkness deeper than anything I'd ever faced before. As I walked out of the diner, I could feel eyes on me, like the whole town was watching, waiting to see what I'd do next. They had no idea who they were dealing with, but neither did I. Not yet. I couldn't get David Harper out of my head. The way those old-timers spoke about him, it was like they were talking about a ghost, not a man who had lived and breathed among them. I needed to know more, so I started asking around. People were polite enough, but I could see the hesitation in their eyes, the way they'd glance away or change the subject whenever David's name came up. It was like he'd been erased, his death a dirty secret the town didn't want to acknowledge. I found myself at the cemetery, standing where I'd seen those lights the night before. The place was even more unsettling in daylight. The headstones were old, some so worn down you couldn't read the names anymore. There was a heaviness in the air, like the ground itself was weighed down by the secrets buried beneath it. I wandered among the graves, looking for anything that might give me a clue about what was happening in Shadow Hill. I didn't know what I was expecting to find. Maybe some sign that David wasn't the first to meet a bad end here. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel behind me. I turned, my hand instinctively going to my side where my gun used to be. An old man was standing there, hunched over with age, his face a map of deep lines and shadows. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with eyes that seemed far too sharp for someone his age. "You're the new guy in town," he finally said, his voice rough like he hadn't spoken in a while. "John Collins, right? Heard you used to be a detective." "Used to be," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I'm just looking for some peace now. Thought I might find it here." The old man let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "You won't find peace in this place, son. Not with what's been happening." I could feel my heart start to race, but I kept my face neutral. "What do you mean? What's been happening?" He glanced around, as if checking to make sure we were alone, then took a step closer. "It's the shadows," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're not just tricks of the light. They're real, and they're hungry. David Harper, he saw them too, and now they're coming for you." A chill ran down my spine. It was like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. I wanted to dismiss the old man as crazy, just another local with too many stories and not enough sense. But something in his eyes, in the way he spoke, made it impossible to ignore him. I could feel the fear rolling off him, and it was infectious. "What do you mean, they're coming for me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. The old man didn't answer. He just shook his head, his expression turning sad, almost resigned. "You'll see," he said, and then he turned and walked away, disappearing among the graves like he'd never been there at all. I stood there for a long time, my mind racing. The shadows, could they really be more than just a figment of David Harper's imagination? Was there something in this town, something ancient and malevolent, that had driven him to his death? And if so, was it coming for me next? I didn't have any answers, but one thing was clear. Shadow Hill was hiding something, and whatever it wasn't going to let me leave without a fight. The day dragged on after my encounter with the old man at the cemetery. His words lingered, gnawing at my thoughts, twisting my gut into knots. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just the ramblings of someone who'd spent too much time alone. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. I couldn't get the image of those shadows out of my mind. Were they really watching me, creeping closer with each passing hour? I needed to do something, anything, to stop myself from spiraling. I went back to the house, hoping to find some distraction in the mundane, but as soon as I stepped inside, the air felt wrong. It was thick, almost oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, each sound sharp and jarring in the stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every shadow in the corners seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, dancing just out of sight. I decided to occupy my mind with something tangible, something I could control. I started sorting through the boxes I hadn't yet unpacked, trying to impose some order on the chaos. But even as I worked, my thoughts kept drifting back to David Harper. What had he seen that had driven him to the edge? And more importantly, was I starting to see it too? My hands trembled as I pulled out an old photo album, one of the few things I'd kept after my wife passed. I sat down on the floor, flipping through the pages, letting the memories wash over me. But instead of comfort, all I felt was a deep, aching emptiness. The faces in the pictures seemed distant, like they belonged to someone else's life, someone who wasn't haunted by shadows. A sudden crash from the kitchen snapped me out of my thoughts. I jumped to my feet, heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen, listening to the silence that followed. Then, slowly, I made my way to the kitchen, every step measured, every breath shallow. When I reached the doorway, I saw that one of the cabinets had flung open, its contents scattered across the floor. But there was no one there, no sign of how it had happened. "Get a grip, John," I muttered to myself, but my voice sounded weak, even to my own ears. I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, maybe a faulty hinge or something. But I knew better. The old man's warning echoed in my mind, louder now, more insistent. The shadows were real, and they were making themselves known. I cleaned up the mess, my movements robotic, my mind elsewhere. What was I supposed to do? How do you fight something you can't see, something that might not even be real? But the fear was real. I could feel it crawling under my skin, sinking its claws into my mind, refusing to let go. By the time I finished, the sun was starting to set, casting long, dark shadows across the room. I stood there for a moment, watching the light fade, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in. I knew I had to do something before it consumed me entirely. I had to find out what was happening in Shadow Hill, and why it had chosen me as its next victim. Night fell hard on Shadow Hill, and with it, the unease that had been gnawing at me all day grew into a suffocating dread. The house felt like a tomb, each room colder and darker than the last. I couldn't sit still, couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept pacing from room to room, checking the locks, peering out the windows into the night. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, the fear refused to leave. I found myself standing at the foot of the stairs, staring up into the darkened hallway above. There was a sound, faint and almost imperceptible, like the whisper of a breeze, but there was no wind. I strained to listen, my breath catching in my throat. It was coming from the attic, a space I hadn't dared to explore since moving in. Something inside me snapped. I needed to know. I couldn't keep running from the shadows that haunted this place. If there was something up there, something waiting, I had to face it. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, its cold metal a small comfort in my trembling hand. The stairs creaked beneath me as I ascended, each step a struggle against the rising tide of panic in my chest. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to see. I had to know what was hiding in the darkness. The door groaned as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the silence. I swept the flashlight beam across the room, the light cutting through the thick shadows that clung to every corner. At first, it seemed empty, just old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. But then the beam landed on something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner, half hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a figure that shouldn't have been there. It was motionless, hunched over, its back to me. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything over the rush of blood in my ears. Who's there? My voice came out in a hoarse whisper, barely more than a breath. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that thing as possible, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I inched closer, the beam of the flashlight trembling as I tried to get a better look. The figure was draped in what looked like a long, tattered cloak, its fabric worn and stained with something dark. And then I realized with a jolt that it wasn't a cloak, it was shadow, thick and clinging to the thing like a second skin. I don't know what possessed me to take that final step, to reach out and touch it, but before I knew it, my hand was hovering just inches from its shoulder. My fingers brushed the fabric, and the cold that seeped into my skin was unlike anything I'd ever felt. It was like touching death itself. The figure stirred, a low, guttural sound escaping from deep within it, and then, in one horrific motion, it turned to face me. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The beam flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows across the walls. The figure's face, if it could even be called that, was a twisted mass of darkness, void of any features except for two hollow, empty eyes that seemed to pull the very light from the room. Those eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew there was no escape. The darkness surged forward, engulfing me in a wave of cold and terror. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat. The last thing I saw before the light went out was that terrible, hollow face, looming closer and closer until it was all I could see, all I could feel. And then there was nothing. I woke up gasping for breath, the darkness still pressing down on me. My heart pounded as I tried to piece together what had happened. The attic, that thing, those eyes. They were all fragments of a nightmare I couldn't shake. But as my vision cleared, I realized I wasn't in the attic anymore. I was lying on the cold, hard floor of my living room, the morning light streaming through the windows. My body ached as I forced myself to sit up. The memory of that figure haunted me, but it was fading, slipping away like a half-remembered dream. I tried to convince myself that's all it had been, a terrible, vivid dream. But deep down, I knew better. Something had happened up there, something real, and it had followed me. I stumbled to my feet, every muscle protesting, and looked around. Everything seemed normal, the furniture undisturbed, the house silent. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was thick, oppressive, like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting. I couldn't stay here, not after what I'd seen. I needed to get out, to clear my head, to figure out what the hell was going on. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, but as I reached for the handle, I noticed something that stopped me cold. My hand was trembling, and not just from fear. There was something dark smeared across my palm, something that looked like soot. I turned my hand over, my heart skipping a beat when I saw the same dark stain creeping up my wrist, some like tendrils of shadow clinging to my skin. What the? I started, but the words died in my throat as I looked down at my clothes. They were covered in the same black residue, as if I'd been rolling in ash. Panic surged through me, and I tore off my shirt, frantically trying to brush the soot away. But it wouldn't come off. It was like it was seeping into my skin, becoming a part of me. I stumbled to the bathroom, my mind racing, and turned on the faucet, splashing water on my face. I scrubbed at my hands, but the dark stains only spread, turning the water black as it swirled down the drain. My reflection stared back at me from the mirror, wild-eyed and desperate. And that's when I noticed it, a faint, almost imperceptible shadow moving behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but the bathroom was empty. Yet I could still feel it, that presence, watching me, waiting. It was in the house, in me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it. The figure in the attic, the thing that had engulfed me in darkness, it hadn't just disappeared. It had left a piece of itself behind, a part of it that was now inside me. As the realization hit, a deep, bone-chilling cold settled into my core. There was no escaping it, no running from what I'd brought back with me. The darkness was inside me now, and it was spreading. I could feel it in my veins, in my thoughts, twisting everything into something unrecognizable. I was becoming one of them, whatever they were, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I backed away from the mirror, fear tightening its grip around my throat. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls warping, the light dimming. And in the shadows, I could see them, dozens of hollow eyes watching, waiting for the darkness to claim me completely. This wasn't just about a haunted house or a cursed town. This was something far worse. It was a corruption, a spreading darkness that consumed everything it touched. And now, it was my turn. As I stood there, staring into the eyes of my own reflection, I realized with a sickening dread that there was only one way out. The shadows would take me, one way or another. The only choice I had left was how much of myself I'd lose before they did. The final chilling thought that passed through my mind before the darkness swallowed me whole was the certainty that I wouldn't be the last. Shadow Hill wasn't done yet. It never would be. When I first arrived at Coldwater Creek, the air felt heavy, like the town itself was holding its breath. The narrow road into the village was lined with dense trees, their branches twisted together as if trying to keep something hidden. My car's tires crunched over gravel, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I hadn't seen another soul for miles. The village appeared as a cluster of modest homes, each one worn down by time. The people, however, were what struck me most. As I stepped out of the car, I noticed their eyes, dark, unreadable, and full of something that felt like suspicion. They stood in small groups, talking in low voices, their gazes lingering on me longer than felt comfortable. I offered a polite nod to a group of elders sitting outside what looked like a community center, but they didn't respond. Instead, they exchanged glances that I couldn't interpret. I was here to learn, to understand the ancient rituals and stories that had been passed down through generations. Yet, as I introduced myself to the elders later that afternoon, I could tell they weren't eager to share. The oldest among them, a man named Samuel, spoke for the group. His voice was gravelly, each word carefully chosen as if he weighed the consequences of every sentence. "We've seen many like you before," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You come, ask your questions, and then you leave. But what you find here, it stays with you." There was a warning in his words, but I tried to brush it off. "I'm only here to understand," I replied, though my voice felt small in the presence of their collective gaze. Samuel just stared at me, his expression hard to read. I wanted to ask more, to press for details, but something in the way they all looked at me held me back. Instead, I thanked them and left, feeling their eyes on me as I walked away. That night, as I set up camp on the outskirts of the village, I couldn't stop thinking about the unease that had settled over me since my arrival. The forest around me was silent, too silent, and the sky had darkened into a deep, oppressive blackness. My tent felt flimsy, a thin barrier between me and whatever was out there. I tried to focus on my notes, but my mind kept drifting back to Samuel's words. I should have felt excited about the research ahead, but all I could think about was the way the villagers had looked at me, as if they knew something I didn't. As I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the canvas above me, I realized I was afraid. Not of the darkness or the forest, but of what I might uncover in Coldwater Creek. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me, and as I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, I wondered if Samuel was right. Maybe some things should stay buried. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rustling outside my tent. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I lay still, listening. The forest was alive with movement, but it was subtle, like something or someone was deliberately keeping quiet. I slowly unzipped the tent and peered outside, half expecting to see one of the villagers standing there, watching me. But there was no one, just the trees and the undergrowth, thick and tangled. I shook off the unease and tried to focus on my work. Today, I planned to explore the nearby mountains where the elders had hinted the tribe's most sacred rituals were once performed. As I packed my gear, I couldn't help but think about the stories Samuel had mentioned the day before. Curses, they called them, ancient and powerful. But I had always been a man of reason, grounded in facts. I wasn't about to let superstition get in the way of my research. The path to the mountains was steep and narrow, cutting through dense forest that blocked out most of the sunlight. The further I climbed, the more oppressive the air became. It was like walking into a different world, one that was older, darker. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional bird call, though even those seemed distant, muffled. As I reached a clearing near the base of the mountain, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. There, half hidden by the undergrowth, was an old totem, weathered and cracked but unmistakably deliberate. Its features were crude, almost grotesque, and its eyes seemed to follow me as I approached. I knelt down to get a closer look, tracing the lines carved into the wood. This wasn't something you'd find in any museum. It was raw, powerful, and filled with a sense of foreboding that I couldn't explain. Why would they leave this here? I muttered to myself, standing up and glancing around as if expecting an answer. The forest remained silent, but the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. It was as if the totem itself was a sentinel, guarding whatever lay beyond. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I pushed it aside. I had come too far to turn back now. Continuing my climb, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive, aware of my presence. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt like a warning. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The stories, the warnings, the way the villagers had looked at me, all of it started to make sense in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. By the time I reached the cave at the top of the mountain, I was sweating despite the cool air. The entrance yawned open like a mouth, dark and uninviting. I hesitated, feeling a sudden urge to turn back. But the need to know, to understand, was stronger. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The walls were covered in markings, symbols that seemed to pulse with an energy of their own. This was it, the heart of the tribe's rituals. And yet, standing there in that silent cave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. The cave was colder than I expected. My breath hung in the air as I stepped deeper into the shadows, the beam of my flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. The walls seemed to close in around me, each step echoing off the stone like a heartbeat. The markings on the walls were unlike anything I had ever seen before, intricate and ancient, as though they were alive, pulsating with a forgotten power. My fingers itched to trace the lines, but something held me back, a deep, instinctual fear that touching them might awaken something best left undisturbed. "Get a grip, Alex," I muttered under my breath, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. But my own voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the cave. I moved forward, each step feeling heavier, like the ground itself was pulling me down, trying to root me in place. The air grew thicker, filled with a strange metallic scent that made my stomach churn. I wanted to turn back, to leave this place behind, but something drove me forward. Curiosity, maybe, or a need to prove to myself that the stories were just that, stories. As I rounded a corner, the beam of my flashlight caught something on the ground. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There, lying in the dirt, was a small bundle of sticks and bones, bound together with strips of leather. It looked like some sort of offering, or perhaps a warning. I crouched down, examining it more closely, and realized with a jolt that the bones were human, small, like those of a child. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. "What the hell is this?" I whispered, though there was no one there to answer. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and suddenly the cave felt much darker, much more hostile. I stood up quickly, the flashlight flickering as though the battery was dying. Panic clawed at my chest as the walls seemed to close in even more, the symbols on the walls swirling in the dim light, as if mocking me for venturing so far. I tried to convince myself that this was just a trick of the mind, that isolation and fear were making me see things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The totem, the villagers, the warnings, they all pointed to something real, something dangerous, and I had walked straight into it. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a rhythmic thrum that vibrated in my bones. The walls of the cave began to feel almost organic, as if they were breathing, subtly shifting in and out with each of my steps. I forced myself to keep moving, but every fiber of my being screamed to turn back. The passage narrowed ahead, and I had to squeeze through, the rock pressing against me on all sides. It felt like the cave was swallowing me whole, dragging me deeper into its belly. Just as I was about to give up and turn back, I saw a faint light ahead, flickering like a distant fire. My heart leapt with a mixture of fear and hope. Someone, or something, was there. I inched closer, my breath coming in short gasps as the light grew brighter. But as I stepped into the chamber, I realized with a sinking feeling that what awaited me wasn't an escape. The light wasn't from a fire or a torch, but from something else entirely, something ancient, something malevolent. The light in the chamber was unlike anything I'd ever seen, pale, almost sickly, with a hue that didn't belong in this world. It seemed to seep out of the very walls, casting long, eerie shadows that danced with an unnatural rhythm. I took a cautious step forward, and the ground beneath me felt wrong, soft, almost spongy, as if I were walking on something alive. My pulse quickened, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, louder than my own footsteps. As I entered the chamber fully, I saw them, figures, indistinct at first, but becoming clearer as I drew closer. They stood in a loose circle around the source of the light, their forms barely human, twisted and elongated. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they weren't standing. They were hovering, suspended in the air as if held by invisible strings. Their faces were obscured, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and empty. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaky, though I tried to sound firm. The figures didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. They just hovered there, their bodies swaying slightly in time with the pulsing light. It was as if I had stumbled upon some ancient ritual, one that had been going on for centuries, uninterrupted by the passage of time. A part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but my legs felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and a perverse curiosity. The light began to intensify, growing brighter and more concentrated until it formed a solid shape at the center of the chamber. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, but the light was too intense, too blinding. I shielded my eyes, but the image persisted in my mind, a figure, tall and gaunt, with an aura of malevolence that sent a chill down my spine. I could feel its gaze on me, probing, searching, as if it were peeling back the layers of my mind, exposing my deepest fears. "Leave," I whispered to myself, trying to break free of the trance-like state that held me in place. "You need to leave." But my feet refused to move, as if the chamber itself was holding me there, compelling me to witness whatever was about to unfold. The figures around me began to chant, a low, guttural sound that resonated deep within my bones. It wasn't a language I recognized, but its meaning was clear. It was a summoning, a call to something far older and more powerful than I could comprehend. I wanted to scream, to make them stop, but the sound caught in my throat, swallowed by the oppressive air of the chamber. Then suddenly, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. The light dimmed, and the figures slowly turned toward me, their faces still hidden in shadow. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin as they began to drift closer, their movements slow but purposeful. Panic surged through me, but before I could react, I heard a voice, soft, almost tender, yet filled with an unimaginable power. "You've come far, Alex," it said, the words echoing in my mind rather than my ears. "But you've strayed into realms not meant for you. Now, you must pay the price." I felt a pressure building in my chest, as if the air itself was being sucked out of the chamber, leaving me gasping for breath. The walls seemed to close in, the figures drawing nearer, their eyes finally visible, dark, empty voids that reflected my own terror back at me. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but there was no way out. The chamber had become a prison, and I was trapped, ensnared in a nightmare of my own making. The pressure in my chest grew unbearable, like a vice tightening around my lungs. I clawed at my throat, trying to force air into my body, but it was useless. My vision blurred, the edges darkening as panic consumed me. The figures were so close now, their cold breath brushing against my skin, making my heart race even faster. I could feel their eyes boring into me, pulling me deeper into the darkness that surrounded them. My mind screamed for an escape, any escape, but there was no way out. I was trapped, suffocating in the thick air of that cursed chamber. I tried to focus, to remember the path I had taken to get here, but it was all a haze, slipping through my fingers like sand. I had come here for answers, to uncover the truth, but now all I wanted was to survive. "Please," I choked out, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Let me go." The light at the center of the chamber flared up once more, illuminating the gaunt figure I had seen before. It was clearer now, its form solidifying into something almost human, but not quite. Its eyes were pits of shadow, and its mouth twisted into a cruel smile as it leaned closer to me. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, like a weight on my soul. "There is no escape," the voice echoed in my mind, mocking and final. "You sought the truth, Alex. Now you will live with it." Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way, and I was falling. The figures, the light, the chamber, all vanished as I plunged into darkness, cold and absolute. I reached out, desperate to grab hold of something, anything, but there was nothing but empty space. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out every other sound, and I could feel my sanity slipping away. But then, with a jolt, I stopped falling. I was lying on the floor of my hotel room, drenched in sweat, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The lamp beside me flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the room. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a dream, a nightmare born from the stress of my work. But when I looked down at my hands, I saw them, dark, bruised marks circling my wrists, as if I had been bound. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and stumbled to the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, pale and shaken, but something was wrong. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging up the glass, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, not my own, moving behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the truth. Whatever I had encountered in that chamber hadn't stayed behind. It had followed me, clinging to me like a second skin, its presence lingering just out of sight, waiting. I could feel it watching, even now, as I stood there, frozen in terror. And in the depths of my mind, I heard the voice again, soft and mocking, a whisper that promised no escape. "You belong to me now, Alex, forever." My name is Samantha Evans, and I've spent most of my life buried in books and museums, chasing after stories long forgotten. I've always had a fascination with the past, with the way art can capture moments and emotions, freezing them in time. But I never expected that passion to lead me here, to Black Rock Manor, a place that feels like it's trapped in its own dark history. When I first received the invitation to stay at the manor, I jumped at the chance. The letter came from an old colleague, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. He mentioned that the estate had a rich history and that its walls held secrets waiting to be uncovered. The moment I arrived, I felt a strange pull, a mixture of excitement, unease. The mansion stood tall and imposing, its once grand exterior now worn down by time. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, and the windows, dark and dusty, seemed to watch me as I approached. The interior was no different. Dust-covered furniture, faded paintings, and cracked mirrors greeted me as I stepped inside. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the silence was unnerving. I could hear my footsteps echo through the empty halls, each step amplifying the sense of isolation. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just the weight of the building's age and the stories it held. But deep down, something felt off. I could feel it in my bones. As I explored the rooms, I couldn't help but notice the strange details. Portraits lined the walls, their subjects staring blankly ahead, but some faces were scratched out, as if someone had violently tried to erase them from existence. The furniture looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades, yet it was arranged in a way that suggested recent use. It was as if the manor was waiting for someone, or something, to return. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see a shadow darting out of sight. By the time I reached the library, I was more curious than afraid. The room was massive, with bookshelves stretching up to the high ceiling, filled with volumes that looked ancient. I ran my fingers over the spines, wondering how many secrets were hidden in those pages. That's when I found the first clue, a journal tucked away behind a row of dusty tomes. The leather cover was cracked, and the pages were yellowed with age. It belonged to Edward Blackwell, the original owner of the manor, and as I flipped through it, I realized I had stumbled upon something far more sinister than I had anticipated. The journal entries spoke of gatherings, late-night parties that went far beyond mere social events. They hinted at rituals, at something dark and forbidden that took place within these walls. My pulse quickened as I read on, the words pulling me deeper into the mystery. I could almost hear the faint echo of laughter and the murmur of voices from long ago, as if the past was trying to break through the veil of time. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, but the chill that crept up my spine said otherwise. I decided to stay in the library that night, poring over the journal by the light of a single lamp. The hours slipped by, and soon I lost track of time. The manor was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards, but the quiet felt heavy, almost oppressive. As I read the final entry for the night, a sudden thud echoed through the hall. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was nothing, I told myself, probably just the old house settling. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me from the shadows. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the faintest whisper of movement in the hall outside the library, like someone, or something, was pacing just out of sight. I told myself it was nothing more than the wind, or maybe the house settling, but that did little to calm my nerves. I kept the lamp burning until the early hours of the morning, the soft glow casting long shadows that danced across the walls, teasing my imagination. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with strange, disjointed images, flickering candlelight, masked figures moving through the manor's darkened corridors, and that same sense of being watched, always just out of reach. I woke up in a cold sweat, the journal still open on my lap, and the uneasy feeling that whatever I'd seen in my dreams wasn't entirely fiction. I shook off the lingering dread and decided to spend the day exploring more of the manor. Staying cooped up in one room wasn't going to help me get to the bottom of this mystery. The morning light filtered through the grimy windows, doing little to brighten the mood of the place. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the silence hung thick around me as I wandered through the manor's winding halls. I found myself in what must have once been a grand ballroom, though now it was nothing more than a vast, empty space with a few broken chandeliers dangling precariously from the ceiling. I could almost hear the echoes of music, the ghostly strains of a waltz that had long since faded into the past. "Why did you come here, Samantha?" I muttered to myself, my voice sounding hollow in the vastness of the room. It wasn't like me to get spooked so easily, but there was something about Blackrock Manor that gnawed at me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was as if the very walls were alive, holding on to secrets that were desperate to be uncovered, or perhaps eager to remain hidden. As I moved deeper into the house, I found a small, dusty room at the end of a narrow corridor. It was clearly a study, with bookshelves lining the walls and a large ornate desk dominating the center of the space. Unlike the other rooms, this one felt different. The air was colder, and a musty, almost metallic scent lingered in the air. I approached the desk, my fingers tracing the intricate carvings along its edge. The top drawer was slightly ajar, and inside I found a collection of old photographs, yellowed with age. The images were disturbing, to say the least. They depicted scenes of masked figures gathered around what looked like an altar, their faces hidden beneath elaborate hoods. The more I stared at the photos, the more I felt a deep sense of unease settle in my gut. These weren't just relics of some eccentric family tradition. There was something dark here, something that made my skin crawl. I flipped through the stack, my hands trembling slightly, until I reached the last photograph. My breath caught in my throat. It was a portrait, taken in the same study where I now stood. A man and a woman, both dressed in fine clothing, stared back at me with cold, vacant expressions. But it wasn't their faces that unsettled me. It was the faint outline of a third figure, barely visible in the shadows behind them. A figure that seemed to be watching me, even now, from the depths of the photograph. I dropped it back into the drawer, slamming it shut with a force that startled even me. I had come to Blackrock Manor seeking inspiration, a story to unravel, but what I found was something far more disturbing. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, that it was watching me, waiting for something. And deep down, I knew I was only just beginning to scratch the surface of whatever dark secrets it held. The sun was setting by the time I left the study, casting long, eerie shadows through the cracked windows of the manor. I couldn't shake the image of that third figure in the photograph. It haunted me, lingering in the back of my mind like a stubborn stain. My thoughts raced as I tried to make sense of what I had seen, but every conclusion I came to felt inadequate, like I was missing something crucial. I wandered through the halls, trying to calm the growing unease that had taken root inside me. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of the wind through the cracked windows, set my nerves on edge. I knew I was being watched. No, not just watched. I was being followed. I could feel it, a presence that stayed just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. At one point, I heard the faintest of footsteps behind me. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, straining to listen. The silence that followed was deafening, and I slowly turned, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the empty hallway stretching out before me. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew better. Blackrock Manor was alive with something ancient, something malevolent, and it had its sights set on me. When I finally returned to the library, the air felt thicker, heavier than before. The fire in the hearth had long since died, leaving the room cold and unwelcoming. I grabbed one of the old books from the shelf, desperate for any distraction that might take my mind off the unsettling atmosphere. But as I flipped through the pages, I realized that the words were written in a language I didn't recognize, filled with symbols and diagrams that made my head spin. What the hell is this? I whispered to myself, running my fingers over the strange characters. They seemed to pulse under my touch, as if the book itself was alive, reacting to my presence. My heart pounded in my chest as I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, a sickening sense that I was trespassing on something sacred, something forbidden. I slammed the book shut, the echo of the sound reverberating through the room, and tossed it onto the table, backing away as if it might bite. My mind raced with questions. What had this place been? What kind of rituals had taken place here? And why was I seeing these visions, these memories of a past that felt all too real? I needed answers, but I was terrified of what I might find. Blackrock was no ordinary manor. It was a vessel for something much darker, and I was beginning to realize that I was in way over my head. The room grew colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I noticed the shadows creeping closer, as if they were drawn to me. I needed to get out of there, but my legs felt heavy, like they were weighed down by an unseen force. I stumbled to the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and yanked it open, nearly tripping over my own feet as I fled into the hallway. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic, like blood. Panic clawed at my throat as I sprinted through the darkened corridors, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. I had to leave. I had to get away from this place before it consumed me. But as I reached the front door, I found it locked, the handle refusing to budge no matter how hard I pulled. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness, lost in the void. Blackrock Manor had me in its grip, and it wasn't going to let go. Desperation fueled my every move as I searched for another way out of the manor. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. It was like the house itself was conspiring against me, changing its layout as I moved through it. I could hear faint whispers, too soft to make out, but persistent enough to make my skin crawl. It felt as though the walls were alive, breathing with a malevolent intent. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled into a small, dimly lit room. The air was damp, and the space was filled with old furniture draped in white sheets, which looked like ghostly figures shrouded in the darkness. I tried to catch my breath, but every exhale seemed to chill the air even further. The only source of light was a flickering bulb in the ceiling, casting erratic shadows that danced around the room as if mocking my fear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became almost tangible. I spun around, desperately searching for the source, but the room remained empty. The silence was almost more terrifying than the voices. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching me, following my every move. I had to get out, but the sense of being trapped was overwhelming. I ran my fingers over the edges of the sheets, hoping to find something, anything, that might help me understand what was happening. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from somewhere in the manor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the library. My mind raced with the image of that book, the one filled with symbols I couldn't decipher. What if it was somehow connected to the noise? My curiosity overpowered my fear. I had to find out what was causing all of this, even if it meant facing whatever was lurking in the shadows. As I made my way back to the library, the corridors seemed to close in on me, the shadows lengthening and shifting with each step. The whispers had become a cacophony of disjointed voices, all speaking at once, and I could barely make out individual words. I was on the brink of losing my sanity. The library door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open with a trembling hand. The room was in disarray. Books were scattered across the floor, and the fireplace had been disturbed, ash and soot marking the once pristine rug. But what drew my attention was the book from earlier. It was now open on the desk, the symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. I approached it hesitantly, each step feeling like a step closer to an abyss. My hand hovered over the pages, and as I touched the book, a chill ran through me. It was as if the book itself was alive, resonating with an energy that was both captivating and terrifying. A figure suddenly appeared in the doorway, a shadowy silhouette that seemed to blend with the darkness. My blood ran cold as the figure stepped into the room, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. "Who's there?" I managed to choke out, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it moved closer, its presence enveloping the room in a suffocating aura of dread. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling from the sight of this apparition. The figure wore a hood, its face hidden in shadow, but those eyes, glowed with an unnatural light. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, and in that moment, I realized that whatever was happening here was far beyond my understanding. The manor was not just a haunted house, it was a gateway to something ancient and malevolent. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the book, and I felt an icy grip on my heart. The whispers reached a fever pitch, and the room seemed to spin around me. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The figure's presence was overpowering, its malevolence almost tangible. I knew I was running out of time, that whatever was happening was reaching its climax. As the figure advanced, I braced myself for the unknown, realizing that the true horror of Blackrock Manor was only beginning to reveal itself. I'm Ethan Davis, a geologist, and I've just arrived in Whispering Pines. The town is a dot on the map, surrounded by dense forest. The moment I stepped out of my car, I could sense an unease in the air, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The locals barely glanced my way as I unloaded my equipment. It felt like I had walked into a room full of whispers, with everyone trying to pretend I wasn't there. The first person I approached was an elderly man sitting outside the local diner. His eyes darted nervously as I introduced myself. "I'm here to investigate the tremors," I said, trying to sound as professional as possible. His response was a gruff, "We don't get many visitors. Why are you really here?" His suspicion was evident, and it only made me more determined to find out what was causing these tremors. The town has a strange aura, as if it's holding its breath. There's an old-fashioned charm to it, but it feels like a mask. As I walked through the streets, I noticed the locals' conversations dropping to hushed tones when I passed. It was unsettling. Even the kids seemed to avoid eye contact, their heads down as if they were hiding from something more than just a stranger. I headed to the local library, hoping to find some historical records that might shed light on the tremors. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with piercing blue eyes, didn't make me feel welcome. She handed over a dusty file without a word and went back to her desk. I skimmed through the documents, which included old maps and records of previous land movements. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the more I read, the more I felt like there was something being kept from me. As evening fell, I ventured into the outskirts where the tremors had been most pronounced. The sky was an ominous gray, and the trees loomed like silent sentinels. I set up my equipment near an old, abandoned mine entrance. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The air felt heavier here, thicker, as if the ground itself was holding its breath. The sounds of the forest seemed louder than usual. Every rustle of leaves or snapping twig made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking just out of sight. The sense of isolation and the locals' strange behavior made me question whether I had ventured into something much deeper and more sinister than a simple geological anomaly. The next morning, I set out to explore the abandoned mines more thoroughly. The entrance was partially blocked by overgrown vegetation and a rusty old gate that barely held together. As I made my way inside, I felt a cold draft hit my face. The air was musty, filled with the scent of earth and decay. I shone my flashlight along the tunnel walls, revealing old tools and debris scattered around. I had barely taken a few steps when I noticed strange markings on the walls, symbols and drawings that seemed out of place. They were crude, almost primal, as if someone had scratched them in a desperate attempt to communicate. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. My footsteps echoed loudly, creating a rhythm that felt unnervingly like a heartbeat. Each sound seemed magnified, as if the darkness itself was alive and listening. As I continued, the tunnel branched into smaller passages. I chose one at random, drawn by a faint, rhythmic noise that seemed to come from further inside. The sound was almost like chanting, but it was too muffled to make out clearly. My heartbeat quickened as I pressed on, the darkness swallowing the light from my flashlight. I found an old iron door set into the wall. It was slightly ajar, and I hesitated before pushing it open. Beyond it lay a chamber filled with old ritualistic objects, candles long burned out, remnants of strange ceremonies. It was clear this place had been used for something other than mining. As I took in the scene, a sudden, sharp noise made me spin around. The door creaked as it swung closed, and for a moment I was sure I saw a shadow move across the room. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. "Get a grip, Ethan," I muttered to myself. But the chill that ran down my spine was undeniable. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for me to uncover its secrets. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe, and every noise, every drip of water from the ceiling, felt like it was coming from something far more sinister. When I emerged from the mines, I was greeted by a heavy silence. The town seemed even more isolated than before. I decided to speak to a few more locals, hoping someone might shed light on what I'd found. However, the people I encountered were even more reserved, their eyes shifting nervously whenever I mentioned the mines or the strange markings. I was beginning to understand why the townspeople were so secretive. The deeper I dug into Whispering Pines, the more I felt like I was unearthing something that was never meant to be found. As night fell, Whispering Pines took on a different character. The once quaint town seemed shrouded in a heavier darkness, as though the night had a substance of its own. I could see faint lights dancing on the horizon, moving in irregular patterns that didn't fit any natural explanation. My curiosity was piqued, but I knew better than to wander out without a plan. I returned to the cabin I was staying in and grabbed my camera and recorder. If there was something supernatural at work here, I wanted evidence. I set out again, this time with the intention of documenting anything unusual. The streets were eerily silent, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots. Each step felt louder than the last. As I reached the edge of town, I spotted a flickering light in the distance. It looked like a lantern swinging back and forth, but there was no wind to account for its movement. I followed it, hoping to get a closer look. The light led me to a secluded area near the edge of the forest. The trees stood tall and dense, their shadows forming grotesque shapes in the dim light. I ventured further into the forest, guided by the flickering light. The trees seemed to close in on me, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. I set up my camera and started recording, capturing the eerie ambiance. The light was now moving in a more erratic pattern, as if something, or someone, was trying to lure me deeper into the woods. Suddenly, I heard whispers. They were faint at first, but grew clearer, becoming a cacophony of voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but there was no one in sight. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I could hear the voices all around me, growing louder, as if they were coming from inside my head. A shadow moved quickly in the corner of my vision. I turned sharply, but saw nothing. I was not alone, that much was clear. I could feel a presence, something old and malevolent, watching me from the darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no response, only the echo of my own voice swallowed by the forest. I made my way back to the cabin, my nerves frayed. The whispers and the shifting shadows were beginning to wear on me. I knew I had to dig deeper, but each step felt like a journey into an abyss I wasn't sure I could escape. Whatever was hidden in the forest and in the town itself was beginning to seep into my reality, challenging everything I thought I knew about the world. The next morning, I felt like a ghost in my own skin. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on me, and the usual calm I had grown accustomed to was replaced by an unnerving tension. I decided it was time to talk to some of the locals, hoping to get more information about the strange occurrences in Whispering Pines. But as I approached the town square, I sensed that the residents were even more guarded than before. I walked into a small cafe that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The smell of old coffee and pastries lingered in the air. The few patrons present sat in silence, casting furtive glances at me. I took a seat at the counter and waited for someone to approach. A woman in her 60s, with a face etched in worry, finally came over. "Morning," she said, her voice shaky. "What can I get for you?" Her eyes were wary, darting around as if afraid someone might overhear our conversation. I'm Ethan Davis, a geologist, I began. I'm here investigating the recent tremors and unusual activities around the area. Can you tell me anything about them? Her face paled, and she glanced nervously at the other patrons. You shouldn't be asking questions like that, she whispered. People around here, well, they don't like outsiders poking around. I pressed on, sensing her reluctance but also her knowledge. Why? What's going on that people are so afraid to talk about? She hesitated, then lowered her voice further. There are things, old things, buried deep in the ground, things that shouldn't be disturbed. The tremors are a sign that something is waking up. I felt a chill run down my spine. And what exactly is waking up? She shook her head, looking around as if expecting someone to overhear. You should leave. Forget about this place before it's too late. Her cryptic warning did little to quell my curiosity. I left the cafe, my mind racing. I needed to learn more about these old things before I could consider leaving. I headed back to the cabin, determined to dig deeper into the town's history. As I sifted through old records and journals, I found references to a series of tragic events, disappearances, unexplained deaths, and a strange ritualistic pattern that spanned decades. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows in my room seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. Each rustle outside my window sent a jolt through my body. I couldn't tell if it was paranoia or something far more sinister. The sense of impending doom was growing unbearable. The town's secrets were starting to unravel, and with each revelation, the darkness seemed to draw closer. I could no longer ignore the possibility that Whispering Pines was not just a town with a troubled past, but a place where ancient, malevolent forces were stirring from their long slumber. I was determined to uncover the truth about Whispering Pines, even as the nights grew darker and the whispers louder. The townsfolk's warnings gnawed at the edges of my mind, but I had already come too far to turn back. I spent the next day digging through old documents in the town's library, searching for any clues that could explain the mysterious tremors and unsettling visions. The air was thick with dust, and every creak of the wooden floor made me jump. Among the brittle pages and faded ink, I discovered a series of journal entries from decades ago. They spoke of a hidden cave system beneath Whispering Pines, a place the early settlers believed was cursed. The entries mentioned strange occurrences, disappearing people, inexplicable sounds, and a ritual that the townspeople conducted to keep something at bay. The more I read, the more it became clear that something was deeply wrong with this place. I decided to explore the caves mentioned in the journals. Equipped with a flashlight, a camera, and a mounting sense of dread, I made my way to the entrance of the cave system. The opening was barely noticeable, concealed by overgrown foliage and rocks. As I ventured inside, the light from my flashlight cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the air grew colder with each step. The deeper I went, the more I felt as if the walls were closing in on me. The passages twisted and turned, leading me to chambers filled with old symbols and faded markings. The oppressive silence was occasionally broken by distant echoes that sounded like whispers, fragmented voices calling my name. I shivered as I tried to make sense of the strange drawings etched into the cave walls. They depicted figures in hooded robes performing rituals and something monstrous lurking just out of view. In one chamber, I found what appeared to be an altar, covered in dust and cobwebs. A chill ran through me as I saw a series of objects arranged on the altar: bones, strange trinkets, and a book bound in what looked like human skin. The book was open to a page with a disturbing illustration of a grotesque creature emerging from the ground, its eyes glaring with an otherworldly intensity. As I reached for the book, the cave trembled violently, and the ground beneath me shook. I stumbled, falling to my knees. The whispers became deafening, filling the cave with a cacophony of unintelligible sounds. Shadows danced along the walls, and the temperature plummeted. The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. Whatever was hidden in these depths was awakening, and it wasn't pleased. In a frenzy, I scrambled to leave the cave, but the entrance seemed to have disappeared. Panic gripped me as I navigated through the maze of tunnels, the whispers now a relentless roar. My flashlight flickered, and the darkness felt almost tangible, pressing in on me. As I emerged into a small, dimly lit chamber, I saw a figure standing at the far end, a dark, indistinct shape that seemed to pulsate with malevolent energy. I was paralyzed with fear. The figure slowly approached, its form becoming clearer with each step. It was then that I realized the figure wasn't just a manifestation of my terror, but something far more real and sinister. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an icy grip of despair. In that moment, everything became clear. The tremors, the whispers, the disappearances, all were part of a larger, dark truth. With a surge of adrenaline, I bolted from the cave and stumbled back into town, my mind reeling from what I had witnessed. As I looked back at Whispering Pines, I knew the truth was out there, buried deep within the earth. And it wasn't just the town that was haunted, it was me, carrying the weight of what I had uncovered, a truth that would never let go.